Started. My name is Ashna Kanda, and I'm the Legislative Director for the ACLU of Virginia. And we are going to be talking about marijuana laws today. We're going to talk a lot about how marijuana reform is a racial justice issue and how it is a criminal legal system issue as well. And we're going to go dig deep into national facts, the national, reports and data that has come out. And then we're going to talk a little bit about specifically what just happened this past legislative session, and then tune into the racial equity piece and what it means like to ensure that laws going forward that have to do with criminal legal reform and more specifically marijuana needs to be equitable and what that actually looks like. And so I'd like to, also inform listeners, again, thank you so much for coming on. If you do have questions, please write them in the chat. And we will come back to it, one, after presenting this kind of national report and looking at facts throughout the nation and Virginia's facts, and then two, after talking about this session. So please write your questions in the chat. At this time, I'd like to introduce Brooke from the National ACLU office, who is the Director of Legal Analytics and Quantitative Research. And we are so thankful that she's on here today to talk more about the national report on marijuana laws that has just recently come out.
Thanks so much. Hey folks, happy to have you on. Excited to talk about some of the data analysis that we've done looking at racial disparities in marijuana possession arrests across the country and focusing specifically on Virginia. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through some analysis that we've done. So just as a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'll tell you a little bit about our report on racial disparities in marijuana arrests. We'll talk about some of the states that have legalized or decriminalized and how that affects or perhaps doesn't affect racial disparities. And we'll take a deep dive into some data specific to Virginia. So as a quick background, folks who are working in the marijuana reform space may be familiar with a report that the ACLU conducted in 2013 called the War on Marijuana in Black and White, which was the first of its kind to look at racial disparities in marijuana possession enforcement across the countries at a national, state, and county level. What we've done this year is try to update that report with a few changes. As many of you know, a lot of states have legalized since 2010, which was the most recent year that data was available in the first version of the report. So we can go all the way through 2018, which is the most recent data that we have available today, and look at how marijuana enforcement has changed in various states. We're looking at trends over time and really focusing on Black and white racial disparities. I can talk more about why those are the sort of racial groups that we honed in on and some of the data limitations in the way that the FBI collects data. And we break down the analysis by state, by county, and by the status of the state, so legalized, decriminalized, or fully illegal. We weren't able to get data for Florida and the District of Columbia, but are hoping to do some follow-up reports, but we have data on 49 states and provide recommendations specific to marijuana legalization, but also specific to policing and general enforcement. Our top line findings, the war on marijuana sort of still is raging on, even though marijuana arrests have decreased since 2010 overall. There's been an uptick since 2015, despite the fact that many states have legalized or decriminalized. And there are racial disparities throughout the country in every single state. Black people are more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana. And in many states that has gotten worse in the past 8 years, since 2010. Marijuana arrests do decrease pretty dramatically after legalization, less dramatically, but slightly after decriminalization. But even in those states that are legalized or decriminalized, these racial disparities remain. And there are limitations to what we can do with this data. While this data is the most comprehensive data that we have, there are limitations to what we can do with this. In particular, the way that data on Latinx folks is collected by the FBI, it makes it hard to analyze disparities between those communities and white communities. And so we can talk a little bit more maybe in the Q&A about some limitations there. So overall, there are more marijuana arrests than for any other drug type more marijuana possession arrests than for all violent crimes combined. There were more than 600,000, almost 700,000 marijuana possession arrests in 2018 alone, and only almost 90% of those arrests are for possession rather than sale. Nationally, we find that Black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. And this is the case despite the fact that Black and white people use marijuana at similar rates. So we don't think that this is because Black people smoke more. We think that this is a combination of factors, but largely due to disparate levels of enforcement. I'm sort of gonna spin through some of the national numbers, and we can take a deeper dive into Virginia. We find that possession arrest rates do decrease after legalization. So here, what the graph that you're looking at is arrest rates in 2010 and 2018 for different categories of states. So states where marijuana is fully illegal still in 2018, marijuana possession arrests went up slightly from 2010 to 2018. In states that decriminalized by 2018, they went down slightly, but not quite as much as in states that legalized. And then in states that legalized, they dropped pretty dramatically. The reason that you're seeing this decriminalized before 2018 and legal before 2018 titles is that there are some states, for example, Illinois, that legalized in 2018, but gets counted as a decriminalized state in our analysis, so that we can look at the before and after effects with regards to the law. So we also find that we can break that data down at the state level. So here what we're looking at is marijuana possession arrests in blue and all other drug arrests in black. So we're trying to look at whether this change is because of marijuana liberalization laws or because of a broader trend in changes in drug enforcement at the statewide level. And what we find is that generally, marijuana legalization or decriminalization doesn't seem to affect the enforcement of other drugs, but it does dramatically reduce possession arrests in legalized states and less dramatically in decriminalized states. So the bad news or the worst news is that racial disparities persist in every single state. So across these 49 states that we were able to analyze, and we strongly suspect, we have no reason to believe that this isn't the case in DC and Florida as well, Black people are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people. Racial disparities are on average lower in legalized states than they are in decriminalized or fully illegal states, but it doesn't seem to be the case that that is because of legalization. So in those states, think Colorado, think Washington, think California, in those states where marijuana possession is now legal, disparities were lower on average even before they legalized. So it could be that there's something going on with those states and their relationship to enforcement that legalization isn't the causal factor that's reducing the disparities. We also find that white people are just more likely to live in a legalized state than Black people. So around 20% of the white population in America lives in a state where recreational marijuana use is legal, compared to it with only around 10% of the Black population in America. So where you live really drives how much marijuana laws are enforced, but also within any locality, there are disparities. Okay, so I want to briefly talk about how racial disparities can go up even when arrest rates are going down. So right here, we're looking at arrest rates for two states, one that has decriminalized and one that has legalized, Vermont and Maine. And the bars that you're seeing are the rates of Black arrests compared to the rates of white arrests for marijuana possession in 2010 and 2018. So if we look at Vermont in particular, we see that arrest rates for both Black people in this yellow color and white people in this purple color are going down in 2018, but they're dropping faster for white people than they are for Black people. So in 2018, Black people are more likely to be arrested, even though marijuana possession has been decriminalized, than white people were in 2010 when it was still fully illegal. And so the rate of disparity has gone up from a 4x increase for Black people to a 6x increase. And if people have questions, we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about how we calculate that rate of disparity. But basically, we're just dividing the rate in the Black population by the rate in the white population. The same is true in Maine, although rates of arrest for both groups went down. They went down faster for white people than they did for Black people. So we don't want to say that legalization is a bad thing or decriminalization is a bad thing. We do want to reduce overall marijuana enforcement. But if that enforcement is reduced selectively, then there's still a huge racial disparities problem. Finally, I want to mention the data limitations that I discussed earlier. We think that it's very possible that these measures of racial disparities are an undercount. And this is because the way that ethnicity is recorded in FBI data means that Latinx communities aren't treated separately as a separate racial group. And so what's probably happening very often in the sort of the way that the data is categorized is that non-Black Latinx people are being categorized as white, whether or not the police see them as white people. And so if that's the case, if many Latinx folks are being categorized as white people, their arrests are counting as white arrests, even if they don't self-identify as white, then that would inflate the rate of arrest among the measured rate of arrest among white people. So if that's the case, our estimates are basically a conservative lower bound of the true rate of racial disparity. And so there are places where we can do follow-up research because that data is disaggregated by ethnicity, where we can sort of start to explore that further. And that's an area of research that we want to continue. There are other sort of areas that we need to focus on more and do follow-up research on. For example, we know from anecdotal data that there are disparities in enforcement among Native and Indigenous communities. There are, which is a category that we can research given the data that we have for Arab and Middle Eastern populations. That data doesn't exist very well. So we're really constrained in what we can do with this data set, which is why we focused on the Black to white disparities. So I want to briefly show you our state profile sheets, which are available for every state. We're going to focus on Virginia for now and just walk through the different information that's available in that sheet. And then we can jump to the digital interactive website that is available for everyone to go in and explore, your own county, your own state. So just briefly, what you're seeing here on the right is a summary of is essentially all of the data that we have available for each state. So Virginia is the 27th worst state for racial disparities in the nation, which sounds like it's sort of middle of the road, but that's mostly because all states are very, very bad in these measures. So in Virginia in 2018, Black people were 3.4 times more likely to be arrested than white people for marijuana possession. There are more marijuana possession arrests than all other drug arrests combined in the state of Virginia in 2018. And that's been consistent sort of since 2010. And Virginia is one of the few states that actually saw an increase in marijuana arrests and possession enforcement between 2010 and 2018. Many states did fall in that measure, but we found for both Black and white people, arrests went up, and they went up more for Black people than they did for white people. So we can look at the counties, but I think the interactive data explorer is probably an easier way to do that. So I'm going to quickly stop my share and move over to showing you the digital piece. So I'll try to share my screen again. The easiest way to find this digital interactive is to go to aclu.org/marijuana. And that has essentially a a digital version of our report that has links to the PDF report and also to this digital sort of data explorer. What we're looking at is a ranking of all states that we have data for, so 49 out of 50, ranked by their rate of racial disparity. So Montana has the worst racial disparities of any state that we looked at. And you can also sort by states. You can filter by legalization status, and you can dig deeper into the individual states. So if we go down and look at Virginia, on the left, you see the rate of Black arrests compared to white arrests over time. You're seeing in Virginia that white arrests increase ever so slightly, but Black arrests are really trending upwards from 2010 to 2018. And on the map, you can hover over counties and look at specific counties. So these are colored by the rate of disparities. The darker counties have worse racial disparities. If we zoom in to, let's say Fauquier County, where within this county, Black people are 6.3 times more likely to be arrested than white people. And so in this box at the bottom, you can see the Black population, the white population, and the number of arrests per 100,000 people. So in Fauquier, over 1,000 Black people per 100,000 are arrested for marijuana possession, and less than 200 white people per 100,000. These stripes indicate one of several things. So they could indicate that this county didn't report data, or that below 50% of the agencies in the county reported data. They could indicate that the population doesn't meet population thresholds that we deem appropriate for the reliability of this estimate, or the Black population could be less than 1% of the population. So if you can imagine, if there are only 10 Black people in a county, then 1 or 2 arrests could make the arrest rate look incredibly dramatic, and those 1 or 2 arrests might not even be of residents. And so we try to use these stripes to indicate where the data is more or less reliable. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share now and see if there are any additional questions that folks have. I have a couple of supplemental slides if we want to get into methodology, but wanted to see if there are questions now or if we wanted to wait for questions later. So I'm seeing a couple of questions about use of the word marijuana rather than cannabis. I can answer that briefly. I am sort of the data person, and so I don't have as much context as some of our policy folks on why that decision was made, but I know that at least at National, when we talked about whether to use marijuana or cannabis in this report, we found that we wanted to make the report as accessible as possible and make sure that people understood what we were talking about. And we found that in some message testing, we found fewer people were familiar with the word cannabis. And so we wanted to make sure people were able to understand the report and feel like it was accessible to them and not a super technical report. But I think the question, I think the sort of feedback on that word is really valid, and sort of over time would like to see more and more shifting to using cannabis as a technical term.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay. I know I would, just to kind of answer that. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Hicks-Wise. I'll be speaking a little later. I thought this was a great opportunity to also jump into that conversation because we started an entire organization named Marijuana Justice, and we had the very same conversation, the same type of inquiry about if the word cannabis is accessible. And we're gonna be really honest, is that what we realize is that the word cannabis is acceptable, it's legal, and it gives a certain frame of white use. Marijuana gives a reference to Black use, people of color, and you're right, it has absolutely been used as a propaganda tool. And now it's our job to reshape that and correct that narrative. But we have to make sure that we don't leave folks behind that have never had a connection to the word cannabis. And right now, all of our criminalization that the ACLU is really debunking and talking about how that's impacted our communities, it's going to be on us right now to empower that word to mean something different in the law, especially. So thank you so much for that question. I think that's going to be something that we continue to talk about as we expand on marijuana and what that narrative is on marijuana in the legal system and just everyday social use.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a much more thorough answer than I think I could have given. I want to answer one question that I think I can speak to, and then we'll allow other panelists to jump in who have a better sense of the sort of policy landscape. But someone asked why there are still arrests in decriminalized, any arrests at all in decriminalized or legalized states, which is a great question. You'd think if something's legal, you can't get arrested for it. But the way that these arrests are categorized, there are still instances in which marijuana possession is illegal. For example, if you're underage, marijuana possession is often illegal in certain contexts or settings. And in some cases, especially in decriminalized states, different amounts are legal. So a larger amount might be still counted as a marijuana possession offense, even if certain amounts are decriminalized. That's, I think, all of the questions. So I can continue looking at and seeing if there are any questions that sort of the data is the right question to answer. But happy to transition and feel free to please flag any questions for me in particular that I missed, but happy to transition into the rest of our excellent speakers.
All right, thank you so much, Brooke. I know that this information has been incredibly valuable to advocates on the ground trying to, say what the facts are, what the differences are when we talk about decriminalization and who it impacts and legalization. So Virginia specific data has been incredibly helpful, and thank you for shedding light to kind of the report and the tools that folks can see online. At this time, I'm going to share my screen as well for a PowerPoint, and I'm going to kind of talk more about what happened this past session, what do some of the new laws mean and look like, and kind of what advocates were able to accomplish. And so let me share my PowerPoint. All right. All right, perfect. Yes, so changes in Virginia's marijuana laws. And so, I do want to continue to emphasize that racial disparities persist in every state that has rolled back marijuana prohibition, and in some cases they have worsened. We're seeing that in places that have decriminalized, such as, in cities such as Cincinnati, and looking at the data there, and, even with New York and how they've tried to address policing, which cannot be done without, legalization. So I do want to acknowledge that and put that as a preface of some of the things that the advocates were hoping to accomplish and talk about this past session. So fighting for equitable marijuana reform at the General Assembly. I do want to take a moment to kind of thank everyone out there who helped in this effort. Again, Marijuana Justice was a huge partner, and we had a ton of community advocates on the ground. I think people were a little bit, and this is why we want to do these webinars, and we did so many events, is folks are interested in knowing why Virginia and why, the ACLU and others were against decriminalization laws, and why we didn't see it as a step forward. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about those details and some of the things that we were able to accomplish this past session. And so, kind of as an offset is that marijuana enforcement, as we've seen from the facts, is racially biased. And this is a policing issue. We also know that criminalizing youth and knowing the statistics is that Black and brown people cannot continue to be left out of the solution. So when we're thinking about marijuana laws and when we're thinking about solutions to be put forward, we need to ensure that they're equitable. We need to ensure that they work the same way for everyone. And we need to address the harms of the past. And so with that kind of mindset, there was a whole, an entire, I want to say a lot of advocates that really came together to and talk to lawmakers to make clear that criminalizing our youth, leaving Black and brown people out of the solution, and how decriminalization was going to do absolutely nothing to address racial disparities and folks' experiences. And so therefore, we actually had proposed that we would want to see a repeal of the prohibition, which means that we understood that there needed to be time and effort spent to understand how to regulate marijuana in Virginia the right way. But at this time, one step forward would be taking the police out of it and repealing the prohibition. Unfortunately, that bill did not get passed, but we had over 1,600 people take action urging their lawmakers for equitable marijuana reform. We had 4 different events that took place, a rally at the Capitol with over 4 speakers and over 40 people that came. We had a sit-in, a gallery sit-in, so that legislators could see over 30 organizations being announced in the gallery, all fighting for equitable marijuana reform. We had a press conference, right outside the Capitol as well, with lawmakers and community members sharing their stories on why decriminalization was not enough and why it was so important to make sure that people of color and Black communities were at the center of the solution and at the center of any reform going forward, recognizing the racial disparities that exist in the system and recognizing the history of marijuana enforcement. And so those were some great, I want to say I'm really happy we were able to change the narrative and that folks, coming in thought that decrim was just, the solution, and we were able to think and learn from what other states have done and look at Virginia's facts and histories and be able to come together as a community and ask that we do equitable marijuana reform. Some of the wins that happened is that the original legislation that was proposed, one, I would actually say this is probably the biggest win, is that it had additional crimes. And so there were additional crimes of smoking while driving, and this decriminalization bill was actually having new laws that were being set in place to be passed, which was, really ironic to advocates like myself when we're thinking about decriminalizing something. How are we still adding new, new laws onto the books in different ways that with harsher penalties than the open container law, for example. And so we were able to, get those new crimes off the books. Criminal fines were reduced to a civil penalty. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's complicated, and I wouldn't, really put that as a complete win. The amount of the penalty did get lowered. So originally, as proposed, there were proposals out there for $50 and more, and it kind of landed at $25. And honestly, the work of advocates in marijuana justice really helped push forward an equitable study to study legalization, right? And so Senator McClellan, who is the patron of that bill, fought to ensure that, legislation going forward, that we would look at data and we would look at Virginia to ensure that we were reinvesting in the communities most harmed, and that we would be looking at it from a objective data standpoint to ensure that legislation going forward would be informed based on that data. The other thing is we were able to prohibit Virginia employers or educational institutions from requiring someone to disclose information on a past marijuana-related arrest, criminal charge, or conviction. And so this was, something that we were really, we met with Secretary Moran, advocates met with multiple people in both the administration and legislators to really push for some of these things. Unfortunately, they didn't, go far enough as we had hoped. And so we'll talk a little bit about what some of those losses mean, but marijuana possession is still illegal. And any amount of it is still illegal till July 1st. So, we want folks to know that. In the legislation that passed, youth is still defined as delinquency. We fought really hard on this, and there's another slide to get into the details of that, but we did not want to criminalize our youth and continue the school to prison pipeline, and that's currently how the legislation is set. The police still have discretion to arrest. So there were multiple stories, of community individuals saying that, you know, I got pulled over and the police officer said, I smell marijuana, as a pretextual stop. And so that is still the case and still will be the case with decriminalization. And the legislation that passed does not stop that. And then also there is no right to counsel if you're charged with a civil penalty. So we'll talk about more, you know, what that means depending on your socioeconomic status and the opportunities you may or may not have that were there before. So the truth about marijuana decriminalization. So like I said, the law goes into effect July 1st. Any possession of marijuana in any amount is still illegal. So what we mean by that, even though it's been decriminalized, a lot of people are like, well, this is a win. You know, now I just got to pay $25 ticket and I get to go my way. We have to recognize that still in the state of Virginia, it's illegal. So when we think about if you're taking the bar exam and anyone's asking about your character assessment, or when you're being asked about your character at your job, it's still, have you been related in illegal activity? Technically, the answer is yes. A civil penalty does not mean that it is not illegal. It is still illegal according to the books. And so we also want folks to know that anything above an ounce is still a felony conviction. And we are talking at the very least 3 to 5 years in prison. And so when we think about the felony conviction, that combined with if you are convicted of a felony, you losing the right to vote, there are multiple, considerations to be had that this is just, we're talking up to an ounce. And that an ounce or higher is still going to be a felony conviction. Anything under an ounce will be a civil penalty, punishable by $25. You should not have a threat to jail time and no criminal record. However, we want to make very clear that the language in the bill says that as long as the intent is not to distribute. So, that is very careful language that was added in. And so if a police officer believes that you have the intent to distribute, no matter what amount of marijuana you possess, it can be an intent to distribute, which is a felony charge in the state of Virginia. So we want to be very careful, advocates, while reading the language of what were some of the changes and what some of these words and really mean. So a lot of people are like, it is not a criminal violation, this is a win. And so I want to kind of get into the details of what it means to be a criminal violation versus a civil penalty. And so before, when this was a criminal violation, you had the opportunity to have a public defender or an appointed lawyer represent. And so we know that Delegate Carol Foy, who was the patron of our repeal the prohibition bill, had even had experiences that when she went to court, she was able to get charges dropped for her client when they had a criminal violation of marijuana. And so that is something that, was incredibly, disheartening to see, is that, yes, it is a civil penalty, but people lose their right to a lawyer and their right to counsel. And there was also the possibility to enter a diversion program resulting in complete expungement after a year. And again, we're talking about that expungement. So I also want to put out there has been no expungement laws passed in Virginia when it comes to marijuana and your criminal record and marijuana. And so, that legislation did not pass. And so that's something also important to know. The reason, I don't want folks that, we do think that we can make progress and that, we're glad. I just want to, by putting, your right to a lawyer and kind of the possibility of entering a diversion program, and then looking at the racial statistics and how this disproportionately impacts Black communities and communities of color. This is just all telling a narrative, right? So when we say this law passed, what does that mean to you? And what does that actually mean to communities? And so the civil penalty, like I said, the person does not have the right to counsel. This is creating a two-tiered system, right? So if I can afford $25 to one person is not the same to $25 to another. There were individuals who were saying that is, I have to choose now between paying the civil penalty and feeding my family. And so that is not a choice that we want folks to be making. And so it really does benefit wealthier people who can pay the penalty or can pay for a lawyer. If you think that you are wrongfully convicted of this civil penalty too, that's something very important to note too, that you would now have to go through the process of hiring a lawyer. Admission of violating the law could keep a person from entering the military or obtaining a federal job or loan, amongst other things, right? And including immigration status, right? So recognizing how all of these things intersect, again, marijuana is still illegal, and a civil penalty does not change that, and neither does a $25 fine. There's a lot of unintended consequences we're seeing. All right, so criminalizing our youth. This is something that, you know, advocates were passionate about, made it clear that in the decriminalization bill, the #1 thing that we would ask lawmakers to change would be to make sure that, you know, marijuana in this law, it was not criminalizing our youth. And so as of now, as the law has passed, possession of any amount of marijuana by a juvenile will be a criminal act, a delinquency. And so what that means is that they will have mandatory drug screenings. Their driver's licenses will be taken away automatically for at least 6 months for a non-related driving offense, right? So we were walking around one day, Chelsea and I, and we were lobbying and advocating to lawmakers, and we had a story of, you know, a grandma who said, well, I don't want to drive my grandson. If he decides to do something, that means that I need to drive him to after school activities, in order for my grandchild to continue being productive, this is putting, you know, really the ownership on me. And so we want to make sure that when we're thinking about our youth and when we're thinking about rehabilitation, taking away driver's licenses for non-driving related offenses is not the solution. And we also know that youth are more likely to make rash decisions. And so this can be another way that people are entering the criminal legal system. And which is the next bullet point, putting young people into a flawed juvenile criminal legal system for a civil infraction for what is a civil violation committed by an adult. And there's a harsher punishment for youth than adults. We want, you know, what advocates strive for was, again, we want rehabilitation. When we think about drugs and when we think about specifically marijuana, rehabilitation is the way to go. And that's what we had proposed, a more rehabilitative approach versus a delinquency charge. All right, now I want to kind of pass it over to Chelsea here, who has been incredible and led such great advocacy on the ground and bringing the community together on this issue.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Ashna. I know that there were some questions about what this means for possession and some other legal things with civil versus criminal. Do you want to take a second to look at those, or do you want to wait until the end? What do you think?
Let's wait till the end. I'll
Okay.
get the questions. Well.
No problem. All right, I am going to share my screen with you all. Thank you so much for staying with us, and I hope we get to be able to get to everyone's questions. These are some really great ones. All right. So all right, we're here. Thanks so much, everybody. I just want to say that the ACLU has really been amazing with the support for ensuring that racial justice is at the front. And that's where the term equitable is really coming from. Looking at the national data that Brooke went over in the very beginning of the presentation shows that the way that marijuana criminalization has happened, it has been a huge impact specifically on African-American community members as well as people of color. I really appreciate as a Black woman that our narratives are lifted and that we are heard through this experience. As we're talking about data, as we're talking about code, we have to remember the humanity of people, and we have to remember the experiences, and all of this jargon really does impact entire families and generations. And looking throughout the generations and the history of marijuana, it's really important that we choose racial justice and an equitable lens that looks at everything nationally, historically, as well as locally in our Commonwealth. So I just really want to say thank you to ACLU for the new report, for the report of Black and White that you all had a few years ago. This has been information and reports that advocates like myself should be leaning into extremely hard. So I'm going to go over these points talking about equitable marijuana reform right here. But as I do it, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about history and why these points matter so much. And as well as not just because, oh, well, $50 is a little bit more money than $25. And Ashna talked about that fight. But the very first is that I talked a little bit about legalization is equitable. Brooke showed us that arrests are still happening with decrim. And I would love, I saw those one of those questions and looking at that methodology, why you think that's happening, but it's still happening. And I'll tell you, not from someone that's deep diving in the data, that most of that is just racism. And we know that from experience of people. And that's my data point is hearing and listening to people. The monetary penalty, we understand that for a very long time, governments, general funds all over the Commonwealth as well as the country have been making money off of criminalizing marijuana and incarcerating people. And fines, fees, lawyer fees, losing jobs. It's been an economic toll on entire communities, not just individuals, families, and generations. So the idea that it has to be no money involved, there shouldn't be a $25 fee, there should be zero fees for a ticket of this sort. But to our view, any other extracting of resources, monetary resources from the communities that we know we are over-policing and over-criminalizing would just continue to be a harmful experience for someone's overall survival. That's an economic pocketbook stance, not just a criminal legal one now, right? The policing tool. This was a really interesting conversation that we had throughout lobbying about what this policing tool is, because let's remember the illegality of marijuana, even with decriminalization, remembering that it is still illegal to have marijuana on you, there will be a consequence. But this illegality has always just been a way to criminalize a certain group of people through the law enforcement. So this is a systems view that we are understanding. So it's not just the incarceration, it also comes down to the policing. And everyone knows the good old line of, I smell marijuana. And we understand that as the gateway to the incarceration system. Not just not a gateway drug. We understand now the data and reports have always been telling us that wasn't true. But it's now about this policing tool of, do I smell marijuana? And is that a reason, even in decriminalization, is that a reason now to search your person, to search your vehicle, to search your home? These can be variety and depending on, especially if you're in a vehicle, okay? And public use, public consumption has been something too. If that's a conversation Brooke has time for, is just talking about how that has been impacted, especially with Black and Brown communities. And that was something that Ashna and I talked a lot about with General Assembly members this past general session, was that even at decrim, this policing tool has not gone away. And it's really just about giving some reprieve to Black and Brown people from being over-policed, right? That's what we're doing. Also treating youth in need of services instead of criminals, y'all. There's been a lot of information reports that even though marijuana is legal, that the use of youth use of marijuana doesn't change at all. So the legality or decriminalization isn't going to cause youth to be like, oh, it's decrim now, I'm gonna go and get some marijuana. That's not actually how youth are reacting, or illegal. So the idea of putting more penalties on youth as we are making it easier, more accessible for adults, to me as a racial justice advocate, I can see and recognize that as a chance for you to say, okay, we won't arrest the adults, but we will criminalize your youth in the next generation. We will continue to make money off of youth prisons. And I know that was something that the ACLU talked about as well, is that over 40% of all of our youth that were incarcerated were for drug charges, nonviolent drug charges. So again, this is another way for the government to exploit our resources, our people, in order for a system that is just not made for us to be there at all. And finally, again, the expungement of records, we have to look back historically. That's the only equitable way to do that forward. And I really appreciate Ashna talking very specifically that there were no expungement record laws or bills passed this session. The way that they are reporting decriminalization tickets is something that we fought very, very hard for. It's for it not to go on your record, as well as some of these records to be sealed. But these are very different things than expungements, and we should all be focused on advocating for expungements. This whole, we're going to seal it special ways that Virginia is trying to do, we need to be very strong and worded to say that we need expungements. Quick history about marijuana, again, is that this has been tax regulated. So this is all about money, whether from the very beginning, the first laws that were ever came about with marijuana to put some type of regulation on it was a tax model. And then the narrative of criminalization came, and that wasn't from the narrative of health scientists. It wasn't from data folks. They actually were putting out reports for the last almost 100 years. They've been putting out reports that say our criminal penalties for marijuana are too harsh. Federal reports, local reports, but that narrative has always really been made by political, media, celebrity, anti-drug, just say no, commercialized. Marijuana was outlawed, right? Again, as somebody said in the chat, it was very much focused to criminalize marijuana, keep cannabis different as far as language. This is just a narrative change, everyone. And it's really important now as we move forward that we are just as intentional with our language. Understanding where marijuana falls with the 3 strike laws historically, and how that has also been part of criminalizing an entire generation of people and families across the country. And then as we're continuing to look forward, marijuana decriminalization continues to still bring disparities on our community. So understanding that our history is still very, very relevant of how we got here. And so we have to take that into the future. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a big reason why we chose our name, Marijuana Justice, because we have to reshape and reframe this entire narrative of how people have now been criminalized. I'm really excited in the last couple of minutes just to talk about the independent Virginia study that this session we were able to pass, as Ashna said, with Senator McClellan. Senator McClellan is a veteran senator at this point, Black woman. I'm really proud that she was able to get this done with us and stand strong with us. So with this study, what it's going to really be looking at is an equitable way to legalize it, regulate cannabis, as well as incorporate social equity within the movement and within laws. I saw a question earlier about states and models. Within our study, we're looking at California, Massachusetts, and Illinois as models. And within this report, now granted this was before COVID, but we were looking at a November 30th report date of when we were expecting it to be done. The study, again, will be providing about licensings for hemp, medical cannabis, and adult use cannabis. We know that medical cannabis has expanded. We can talk a little bit about that. I will say, I saw a question as well about NORML, Virginia. NORML has been doing this work for a very long time as well. As a racial justice advocate, I always try and practice the equity and inclusion steps and actions. And so prior to starting Marijuana Justice, we actually did go to NORML. We researched NORML, looked a lot at what NORML was into, but because NORML, unfortunately, is half of medical marijuana, and the way the systems are just set up right now, unfortunately, medical marijuana is just as inequitable as legal use or possession right now. We did not, especially as racial justice advocates, did not feel like NORML right now was ready to take racial justice as a priority with legalizing marijuana. Legalizing marijuana can be your priority, but if it doesn't come with an equitable package of racial justice, then maybe we're not totally aligned to work together. But NORML was there and was able to testify with decriminalization, and there were some things that they were able to support us with. So I think that there's enough room here for everyone, but I think that we've got to also take notice of who has not been in this work for a very long time. And I'll tell you what, when I went up there and talked about marijuana and cannabis in that General Assembly, y'all, there were not many people that looked like me. So people might have been doing this for a very long time, y'all, but let's think about who folks were and who they were bringing to the table. And that's what marijuana justice and ACLU is really doing. So we're looking at studying the process that's requiring expungements of records and restorations with cannabis and decriminalization. We're looking at methods for diversifying ownership throughout the market, all of the markets, as well as a potential community investment fund, which would be a social, to be able to grant and re-grant social equity projects. So I'm really excited about this. I just want to remind everybody that marijuana and cannabis, we see this as 3 tiers of criminal justice, social reinvestment, and health and wellness. And that has to do with home grow. So I know that's something we didn't talk too much about, but that is, again, an equitable piece for having your medicine accessible. So thanks so much.
All right, I think we're gonna do questions for the last 5 minutes. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of read out some of the questions that I am seeing, and then Brooke or Chelsea, if y'all wanna, we'll try to facilitate this and see who's best to answer the question. So one of the first questions, there was a couple about immigration status and how for non-citizens would this have different consequences, and I can kind of start that answer and then feel free to chime in. And the answer is yes, right? So federally speaking, we know that this substance is illegal. And I think even within Virginia, you know, when we're thinking about how folks are being pulled over and getting caught into the system, the criminal legal system, and how that is leading to immigration consequences, marijuana is a key driver of that. Not to mention that, you know, I've had family members, or when you're trying to get your citizenship status, and again, looking at the character assessment, as long as the substance is illegal, this does play a portion on that. So there is definitely immigration consequences intertwined and interrelated with marijuana enforcement. And we know that in the nation, it was the fourth reason for the largest amount of deportations that took place in 2018. The other question that we got is multiple questions about how soon do we expect Virginia to legalize, and what states should Virginia model? Chelsea, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question. So there are a couple different moving parts that we have going on right now. So as we said before, that our report that is going to be an independent study by JLARC should be out November, December. Again, that was before COVID. There's another committee that has been set up that is basically a working group of legislators, as well as some appointees, officials, that will look at other laws, and they're going to come up and suggest legislation for legalization. And that just also got pushed back a little bit more till later on to 2021, correct, Ashna?
Actually, no. So the legislators voted it down. So we should be expecting both reports as of now should be expected with their due dates. Again, that's, you know, to be decided if it does change due to COVID.
But if I'm being honest with you, and tell me what you think too, Ashna. At this point, I think that we're looking at 2022 for legalization in the General Assembly for that to pass. I think we're going to still be looking over and reviewing these reports that come out at the end of the year, but then we have session. And from there, I know, as well as an equitable advocate, sometimes I do feel like I have to slow people down in order to analyze the data so that we know what to ask for, because we have been left behind for so long that if we don't have the data to come back and say, this is what we deserve, then it's going to be really hard later to be like, hey, I know y'all making billions of dollars off of cannabis. Y'all mind sharing the wealth with us? And they never have. That's not something they're going to give up just because they feel good. So I think it's going to be important that we have the information, the data, and the voices behind what we want for that to come. So 2022 is what we're looking at.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add to that, and when we're thinking about the committee, right, this committee of who was on the committee, we pushed to have, you know, public, you know, we have VACA, the Commonwealth Attorney Association, that's on serving on the committee. We have NORML, we have, you know, legislators, but what we don't have and what we're missing is kind of that equitable piece. We don't have the public defenders. We don't have, you know, community advocates, community leaders in communities of color, youth, you know, justice advocates to really be sitting around the table together and thinking through legislation that's going to be proposed. And so I do want to put out there that in the committee, it was a choice point for lawmakers and the executive government to take on who would serve on that committee. And so, you know, we didn't see that we had the representation that was necessary to get it right the first time. And kind of the way Chelsea was saying is that we got to slow down and we need to get it right. And getting it right means looking at all of these different facets of the system and how they interact with one another, and talking to community members on the ground, youth advocates, and public defenders on what they're seeing is going. And so you know, we really want everyone to continue to stay involved and really look out for those report findings, and then continue to advocate based on that and what legislation should look like.
Yeah.
All right, so another question we had is there any reason why anyone would be arrested for having weed in their possession? An example, if you have 1 or 2 possession charges and you haven't paid the fine associated with the charge, will they lock you up for failure to pay fines? So that question was asked on Facebook. I can start, but Brooke, did you want to answer that?
I think you can speak probably better to the local Virginia context, but that definitely is a thing that happens. And I think a lot of the stacking criminalization of, you know, as Chelsea mentioned, that marijuana being sort of the gateway charge is part of what's driving these disparities, is that those initial disparities stack on top of each other.
Oh, that's very true. And Chelsea, if you want to come in, I mean, my personal, we're still trying to figure it out, right? So what lawmakers had told us and what other, you know, what the executive director, government had kind of told us was that, you know, the governor and others was that, look, we're not expecting that that's going to be an outcome. However, we, you know, post July 1st, our advocates are watching out, and we're trying to see how these laws are actually going to be implemented and, you know, the implementation of these laws. So that's something that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, Christopher Rashad, that was a great question, and this is going to be new. So what we're going to ask everybody watching is to reach out to us if that stuff happens. Tell us the stories. We need to know these conditions and who's doing it well, what people are feeling, so that we can, again, advocate this coming up General Assembly, even if we don't get legalization, but how to ensure that decrim is doing less harm and the least harm as possible. So as we're working through this, please let us know if you feel like something is not right.
Great. So another question, so there was something about police enforcement and CBD and how police are confused. Chelsea, do you want to kind of speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a great question. Thank you for that. Because what I'm hearing from CBD advocates right now is that a lot of times law enforcement will mistake their CBD for cannabis, for marijuana. And it will be a conversation about that. And that right now, to be very honest, is, again, we would love for more CBD advocates and partners to come and tell us those stories so that we can be and included with that. I will say that that's not something that we took on right off with marijuana justice, because it was just, again, not as criminalized, and we're going after the most vulnerable right now. But there is absolutely a place for that, because that is, again, another reason to say, oh, it was CBD, but by the time you go through the process of proving it's CBD, you've now been biasly policed, over criminalized, and who knows the other consequences of that. So thank you so much for that question.
All right, I know it's 2:03 and we promised folks that we'd be done at 2. We really appreciate the questions, and again, continue to contact us and we'll continue to answer them. I know one of the last things were, what can I do going forward? We're gonna continue, please tune in with Marijuana Justice and ACLU, and we'll continue to put out there what the next asks should be. But this presentation today really talked about our values and what we'd like to see in any legislation going forward. Brooke and Chelsea, do you have any last comments or things that you want to say?
I would just to say thank you. MarijuanaJustice.org is and THC Justice Now are our handles. Remember, recreational adult use is not legal, still very much not legal. So if you are buying it right now is with a prescription, and we know that even access to medical health care right now is an inequity. So if we're having more conversations about that, I would love that conversation, but please follow us. And we just hope that everyone's doing well in this time. And thank you so much for ACLU for hosting us and hosting all of these webinars.
Yeah, thanks. That's the main thing I want to say as well. You know, the work that we do on the data side, it really is just to serve as a tool for advocates who are doing the real work on the ground. So thank you so much to everyone who listened in and who's going to take this work and go out and put it to good use. Thanks for everything you're doing, and thanks for hosting.
Thank you so much, Brooke and Chelsea, and thank you everyone who was able to attend today. Please stay safe and please stay healthy. Thank you.